So I'm Achilleas, and I want to talk to you about how I think we've gotten the whole thing terribly wrong when it comes to creativity and art on chain. And to do that, I want to begin by dissecting this cursed word and this cursed construct that we call the NFT. What is the role of the NFT? Well, the idea primarily was as sort of a magical instrument that would be able to transform and transport all sorts of masterpieces and artifacts from the offline world to digital space. And that was, it was heralded as like, you know, this renaissance of creativity post the mechanical production of the last 60 years. And, you know, I will take you back 90 years ago to some guy called Walter Benjamin, who was a very innovative theorist at the time, wrote many things around philosophy, you know, of all sorts, and also talked a lot about the sort of the way that art and the art industry has been basically castrated by the notion of mechanical production. So he has this notion of aura. The aura for Benjamin is the sort of unquantifiable je ne sais quoi, or je ne sais pas, I don't remember, I don't know French, that emanates and emerges from things that are spatially and temporally located. So things that are located somewhere, that are unique, have a sort of presence and a pull to them. So a thing is sacred insofar as it has this presence. So something at a gallery, an object, a sort of an artifact for some religion, has an aura that draws you to it because it's located from a distance from you. And then mechanical reproduction comes along. And mechanical reproduction is sort of the idea that you can recreate images and, you know, artworks across the world with like film and pictures, and then the Mona Lisa is no longer at the Louvre, the Mona Lisa is now everywhere. And the moment the Mona Lisa is everywhere, then the aura that it emanates when it's located somewhere is kind of gone. There's no distance anymore, there's no uniqueness. I have like a, you know, screenshot here of a Manet painting, who was one of the Benjamin's favorite artists. And, you know, it has even a sort of watermark at the bottom right. And this sort of artifact is no longer anywhere specifically. It's kind of everywhere, and I don't really feel anything when I look at it because it does not have a unique presence that can sort of draw me to it. There's no distance from me to it. It's like there, it's also on your screen if you're online, etc. So what some people said was that the NFT as a sort of digital unique object can bring back uniqueness and objecthood, right? It can have a digital aura because it's located somewhere and has a presence there and has the same kind of gravitational pull as a real object does. But what we got instead was this kind of stuff. And I'm not really convinced that pictures with some edit on them that have different like hats and shoes and shirts actually bring back the sort of sacred presence that artifacts have. And the reason for that is that the aura is not something that just emanates from ontological concerns such as, you know, objecthood, but also something that is fundamentally ritualistic. So for Benjamin and for many others, art has a fundamentally ritualistic basis, which is that the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual. That is that the value of an art piece or of an artwork or of an artifact originally was its value in mediating some sort of communion between different people and to create some sort of behavioral basis for the ritual to be carried out, right? So you can think of a religious artifact like a cross in a church. The point of the cross in the church is to create the conditions for a ritual that happens around that object, and then that's imbued with some sort of metaphysical value, etc. And that's, you know, the origin of art for Benjamin is the ritualistic basis. So cult value has become exhibition value. There's no longer any sort of, you know, emanated utility of ritual from an object. This is now just an object, and that's why we've lost the sort of aura. And so bringing objecthood back to digital objects is not sufficient to create meaningfully communal experiences that are artistic in nature. And so the NFT as a notion is a reduction construction, and I think the wrong primitive for digital art in a wider sense of the word. I think we need something different instead. I think people are experimenting with different things under different guises. And these things require three more components, right? So you have the ontology, which is the object of something, but you also need allocatedness, which is the topology of it, and also the ritualistic basis for the object to actually be able to imbue with some kind of meaning. And for me, I call that sort of combination in the digital in the digital space, an Artchain. So what is an Artchain? Well, let's start with the components first. So ontology is what we have already, right? You have digital objects, which are persistent, and they're unique, and they're ownable, they have provenance, and are programmable. So for digital world, that's like an NFT, right? It has all these conditions. In the physical space, a painting does the same thing, or a performance, a theater that is waiting for Godot's there, also has sort of an ontology because it's somewhere. But all of these things only exist in abstraction, right? So, ontology in abstraction is just an object by itself. And an object by itself is not sufficient for communion or meaning, because it just exists in sort of, some liminal space. So that's why these things have become fundamentally financial in value, because the only thing you can do with an object is to trade it and to hope that its value goes up arbitrarily or goes down arbitrarily. So over time, anything that originally emanates some sort of, feeling to it when it doesn't have a context around it or a locatedness to it becomes merely an object and then merely a tool for speculation. So objects clearly not enough for communion. I think we've seen that. That's why the whole thing crashed over the last 2 years, is because we just had objects floating around that became eventually currencies, right? So what's the second component then? I'll call it topology. Basically, I mean like context and location. So an object is meaningful because of its context. Where is it? How did it get there? What is it doing there? What other things are around it? Who is looking at it, right? Who made it, etc. And therefore, meaningful objects are autonomous and conversant with their wider reality because they exist in a wider context. And that's what gives them meaning. So in digital spaces, for example, they can do so in persistent spaces with enshrined rule sets, such as blockchains, because there's context around them. And then they become relational, right? They're defined insofar as they relate to something else. An example of topology is gallery space, right? Which imbues an object with the sort of prefix of it being an art object. The same thing in the desert is not an art object. The sort of Duchamp's toilet in a toilet is a toilet, but Duchamp's toilet in the Tate is an art object because it's sort of, contextualized in the historical and topological space of the gallery. Achievements in gaming are relational and topological because you only get it if you do something to get it. So it's contextualized within a wider net of actions and behaviors. A POAP, an object you get if you scan a QR code somewhere, is also has locatedness in it because it results from you being somewhere at a given point in time. The ZK-TLS stuff that Bas talked about earlier as well, like some proofs about something you've done are also, the proofs themselves are relational and topological in nature. So the topology we have so far with, so-called crypto art and NFTs is the only rationality again is to money, right? The only way you can get something is if you have more money than someone else, which means you get a rare object that relates only to other non-rare objects or rarer objects than that. Clearly, I think this sort of construction is not sufficient for meaning in the widest sense of the word. Gaming is closer to that because, you get an in-game object or an achievement insofar as you've done something with a reputation, and then that relates you to a wider, sort of more complex and expressive web of relations to other players and other objects and other achievements, etc. There's like a semblance of meaning there because there's some sort of context that imbues the object with some meaning vis-a-vis its wider context. The art world, I think has even more of a sort of expressive web there because the raw materials are crafted into an artifact, right? So there's a sort of lineage there of something is transformed to something else that is conversant with its historical and formal context, be it in some sort of gallery or in some book, or in our conversations after we go to the gallery, or after through a play or after we go to a concert, etc. And there's more meaning there because again, there's more of a sort of journey around the different locational components of the object that we're looking at. The third component, which I think is the most overlooked one, and the more important one, is the notion of a ritual. I don't want to define a ritual here necessarily, but we can sort of think about it as a communal process that has a non-deterministic interactive outcome, but is located within a mutable rule set. Rituals often have sacrifices involved in them, and I think there's a good reason for that, is because the sacrifice sort of implores some cost on the participants of the ritual to be able to carry out the ritual, right? If there was no sacrifice, then anyone could participate in the ritual. But if you have some sacrifice inherent in rituals, then be it capital sacrifice, reputation sacrifice, some sort of make-believe sacrifice, you create the space that's necessary for trade-offs to exist and for people to actually be more involved in something and something else. And rituals lead to like a long-term, that's big words there, and it's philosophy, and I'm at a crypto conference, but nonetheless, a long-term dialectical architecting of the meaning landscape, right? So like over many iterations of rituals, you start to create meaning and a story and a narrative that underpins the ritual, and therefore the objects located within the ritual itself. And like it's also conversational between like the sacred and the mortal, right? Like we sort of do rituals because we want to connect with something that's not necessarily tangible, like love or like God or whatever it might be, or winning a raid. So here's some examples of rituals. Burn mechanics, I think, in NFTs are very interesting rituals because you get some object and you burn it for something else, right? So there's a loss there. You undergo, like with Gen Art mints, for example, the thing you get at the end is determined by some sort of entropy of the blockchain, right? So the moment you press mint, there's some magic happens cryptographically, and you get this new object. And I think this experience actually imbues Gen Art mints with some sort of relationality, with some ritualistic underpinning to them, and therefore with some meaning at the end. The mass is a ritual, right? Like people congregate and there is like objects around them and they sort of go through some motions and read some parts of a text, and then they feel like they're more, in touch with themselves, each other, and something above them. MMORPGs are also rituals, like a raid when everyone goes together and congregates sort of to fight some, evil other, has all of these components there itself as well. It's a communal process, it's a sacrifice inherent in it, and it creates a meaning in the actions you undertake, and also meaning to the object you get at the end of the raid, right? You get a rare loot. The reason why you want it is because you had to undergo the ritualistic process to get to that point. It's not just because it's rare in some sort of liminal abstracted space. So basically, I think, properly manifested world building or meaning on the meaning landscape, which are all sort of related things, is something that looks a bit like that. It's like people communicating with each other and with something else through a web of complex, located objects that relate to each other in some sort of ritualistic aspect, right? So this is true of games, this is true of religious rituals, this is true of music concerts, it's true of creativity, and this is also true of artistic creation and artistic exhibition. It looks something like that. So I think the thing we've messed up a bit with is we took the object as the fundamental primitive of digital art. I think instead when you take the whole meaning landscape as the primitive there. And I call that an Artchain. So an Artchain is basically a persistent, quasi-autonomous, interactive artwork that is anchored to a bespoke virtual machine. So the whole chain is the artwork, right? You deploy a chain, an artist deploys a chain, and that is what the artwork is, not the objects within the chains themselves. Custom precompiles and fork choice rules allows for eternal, non-deterministic, communal performance art pieces, right? So you take a chain, you take the EVM, you mess with it a bit, you add sort of some custom rules. An example could be it emits objects every 60 years. An example could be like if some interaction happens by the participants, then there's some other rule that allows for some other object to emerge, or something is burned at some other place, or some bridge is sort of broken, or some sort of contract is mutated according to some original rule set. And these rules allow for an emergent coordination, therefore an emergent dialectical relationship between the participants and the artist in this case. So this chain is prophesized by the artist in the sense that it's deployed by someone with like a artwork in mind, but it's merely the vehicle for conversational interaction between participants. And in my mind, the sort of evolution of that is you had the shared contract originally where you could add another object to a smart contract. That was all you could do, and that was pretty lame. And artists deployed contracts, which means the artists could deploy full contracts that housed their objects and artworks, but there were interactions there that were more meaningful because there was more locationality to them, and there were more ritualistic aspects to them. And the final evolution of that is a chain that's deployed by an artist as a fully fledged, maximally expressive, eternal, sort of ruin in the internet, like a digital ruin that people can explore, interact with, and unlock different components of it. You can think of it as a performance piece that just runs forever by itself, basically. This is a slide I stole from Stam Hart's talk a couple of days ago, which has the same sort of interaction there, right? Like, what is the artwork? Is the thing that mediates the artistic creativity with the audience's insights that are taken from interacting with it meaningfully. And then the audience leaves with a subsequent experience, effects or perceptions, some meaning emerges from the audience who interact with the great artwork, and the artist leaves with sort of an experience that can affect their future creativity. And all I'm saying is, just take this whole thing and make it a blockchain. I think it's going to work really, really well, and it's definitely going to work better than monkey pictures. So what are the sort of insights here? Don't conflate the art with the NFT, right? The NFT is a vessel for objects. It might be artistic in some respects, mostly not. but it's fundamentally just a primitive that you can use in a wider context. Digital objects are only meaningful as vessels of emergent properties of artworks. Bespoke virtual machines, I think, are a very good candidate for canvases, artistic canvases, with other primitives around them as various art supplies. And I think they can also function fundamentally as playgrounds for resistance and communal wall making, right? So what Benjamin was talking about as well, with the death of the aura, had a positive side effect, which was that art is becoming more democratic and communal. People can interact and create together across the world, in a decentralized fashion. That was 1935, by the way, right? But the good side effect was that everyone is now able to partake in meaning making. Not those who just go to the gallery or those who are able to be exhibited in the gallery, but also everyone who's able to interact with something, back then on the television or the radio, now on the internet, and soon on sort of the blockchains, right? And in the blockchains, the participant is as powerful in some ways as the artist himself. So, here you have Marina Abramovich's exhibition. I'm not a big fan of her, but I think this is like a good example of a collaborative artwork, right? Where it's just them staring at each other for 9 minutes. That's the artwork. But you have a participant and an artist mediated by an object, in this case the chairs and the table, and also the gallery space, who create some sort of meaning through their interaction. And the meaning would be not there if you just have the table in abstraction. So, I think you can make this into a sort of interesting construction, basically, or like generalize this into interesting construction. So, this is the sort of taxonomy here. What has been the case so far is we thought that the NFTs will be community sort of scaffolds and join my community by buying my picture. I don't think that works because, again, the objects by themselves do not have the necessary and sufficient expressivity for them to become meaningfully communal, right? So it just ends up in a weird circle jerk of please buy my bags and pump the floor price. And that's very, very sad. Instead, if you reverse the causality there and you start with the community, and you give them the correct tools to sort of congregate in a localized way with a rich topology, with rich rule sets, and ritualistic basis there, which has been what's going on for thousands of years across all creative media. And then objects emerge from an interaction, right, only as a result of some interactions in there. Then the objects are meaningful. And then you can have the NFT as sort of an interesting artistic object. But it only works if it's the emergent property of a wider expressive landscape. You might notice that the stuff I'm talking about sounds a lot like the autonomous world sort of meme, because I think they're kind of like the same thing in a way. I think if you take digital art and you imbue it with topology, ontology, and ritual, and you end up with something like an Artchain, which is an autonomous golem that acts as the coordinating mechanism for participants and authors, it looks very much like if you take an on-chain game and you imbue it with persistent autonomy and expressivity and end up with an autonomous world. Both of these things are constructs that are persistent, that are open, and that are the fundamental basis for ritualistic expression and also objecthood in some respects. So they're both like an autonomous golem in some ways. The only difference is that, the left side is like artists approaching it, and the right side, my right side is artists approaching it, and the left side is sort of game developers approaching it. I think it's more likely that artists will create the first truly sort of, masterpiece in the digital world era because they just have the kind of imagination and immersivity that allows for the creation of things that are fundamentally interesting to look at and watch, not just for financial value, but it's also likely that, games will reach the same thing, and I think they're the same thing anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter which way it arrives at. I think that's it. That's it. Thank you so much for bearing with me on this rather philosophical journey.